Hey, my name is Wendy, and I'm going to be filling you in on some facts about China's weapons of mass destruction. The country of China has a long and respected history around the globe, but after the turn of the century and up through the 20th century, as times have changed us all, they've developed into more of a world power. They did not want to be seen as a weak state in the international community. They had self-perception of being a victim in the world and had to develop any leverage it could to oppose the world powers. So China chose to use proliferation activities to help them develop political alliances with North Korea and other countries, strategic weapon systems, and economic growth for their best interests. Iran and China have had a long history of exchanging military-related information and supplies. China supplied them with more than just nuclear missile technology. They helped them with mining and enrichment of uranium as well as the equipment and designs to implement it. But they all gained from helping North Korea in its weapons programs. Up until the late 90s, China had been actively proliferating WMD information and technology to other states in the region to help develop a good standing relationship and economic boost for itself. But as pressure mounted from the UN, mainly from the United States, they took a different look at proliferation and how it was going to affect them and their standing in the world. They began to slow their exports of military-related information and technology. This caused a shift of power and a struggle to contain what it had let out. China sided with the UN and United States and held a view of non-proliferation of WMD-related equipment and information. They made many pledges and stood next to sanctions that the UN would impose on those that they just helped a few years earlier and would seek out nuclear weapons. This would allow the part of the world stay more stable and keep this valuable information out of the wrong hands. China had gained as much as it could from its former customers, and now the shift of power was occurring. China made public statements in the early 2000s to stop any form of weapons to help other nuclear-seeking countries. This was a big blow to Pakistan. They had the nuclear warheads but lacked the needed missile technology to make them a threat to anyone. Although these public statements were made, Chinese companies were still suspected of aiding Pakistan and maybe North Korea. China has become a major force in the South Asia region. They would like to keep peace with all of those in the area and prevent any military action from the United States. China has developed a much stronger export controls relating to all military or dual-use equipment or materials. They have already had to fine companies for not allowing the regulations it has set in place to control its exports. This is putting China in a much better place in the world's view of their stance on weapons proliferation. During the 20s, after the end of World War I, China was still being controlled by the European countries it was helping during the First Great War. The people revolted, and a power struggle between the CCP, Communist Party of China, and the KMT, Kuomintang, or Democratic Movement, which held most of the control. The KMT army tried to drive out the CCP in 1934, but failed and they fled north. During this time, Japan had to come to occupy Manchuria, a northeastern sector of China. Japan and China were at full-blown war on July 7, 1937, the start of World War II. The KMT could not fight both the Japanese and the CCP, so the CCP and the KMT joined forces to help drive the Japanese out of Manchuria. With the bombing of Japan in August of 1945 and all the surrender to the U.S., China had looked toward the KMT to start rebuilding. In January of 1946, China was again divided by the CCP and the KMT. The CCP was getting aid by their communist brothers, the Soviet Union, while the KMT was being aided by the U.S. 1948, China was in a civil war, the CCP taking over much of northeastern China and working its way south by southwest and driving the KMT out of control and out of the mainland China to Taiwan. The nuclear plants at Yibin was one of the first production fuel plants that China put on the line in the early 60s. The nuclear fuel component plant is focused on plutonium fuel rod fabrication and plutonium production and processing for nuclear weapons. The nuclear fuel plants are engaged in the production of tritium and Li-6 deuterium as part of China's nuclear weapons program. China's SLBM are much less numerous and less reliable than their land-based counterparts. These are the JL-1 and JL-2 missiles. The Chinese have 12 of the former and 36 of the latter, which having a yield of approximately 200 to 300 kilotons. The JL-1 missile has an estimated range of 1,000 kilometers, which is 620 miles. The JL-2 missile has an approximate range of 7,400 kilometers or 4,600 miles. While China possesses these missiles, they're not fully operational, and it's supposed yet unknown whether the Chinese have warheads available for them. In 2011, the JL-2 failed launch tests from the New Gen-class nuclear submarine. In addition to these missiles, the United States Department of Defense considers one of China's cruise missiles to be a potential threat, the DH-10. At first, the Pentagon believed this missile to be only useful as a conventional weapon. Later, however, the Department of Defense found that the DH-10 missile has the potential to support a nuclear payload. These missiles almost exclusively use solid propellants, which is a recent change in fuel source. The advantages of solid fuel rockets for the Chinese outweigh those of their liquid-fueled cousins. One of these advantages is that it makes the missiles much easier to handle over long spans of time, which would make sense since China is stockpiling missiles for potential rather than expressly intended use. This is due to instant ignition without complex fueling operations required with liquid fuel. These new technologies present a huge step for the Chinese military in their abilities to operate worldwide.